The night Duke Cassian Valecourt married Lady Aurelia Thornhaven, every candle in Blackthorn Cathedral burned at full height, and not a single flame trembled. 1,200 guests watched the most powerful man in the kingdom take a bride he had never once looked at with anything resembling warmth. What none of them understood, what even the bride herself would not fully comprehend until the bedroom door closed behind them, was that this was not a union, it was a burial. Cassian had already decided what she would become. The dead do not argue. The forgotten do not resist. But if you stay until the very end of this story, you will learn what happens when a man buries someone who refuses to stop breathing. The dominion of Blackthorn stretched from the Ashen Mount Range to the western coast, a territory so vast that messengers on the fastest horses needed 6 days to carry a single command from the capital to its farthest border. The duchy controlled 3 deep water ports, 11 mountain passes, and the only navigable route through the Grey March Valley, which meant that every merchant who wanted to move goods between the northern kingdoms and the southern trade cities paid tribute to the Valecourt name, not because they respected it, because the alternative was starvation. Cassian understood this arrangement perfectly. He had inherited it at 23 when his father collapsed during a council session and never regained consciousness. The old duke had ruled through contracts, thousands of them, layered across generations, binding noble houses to the Valecourt dynasty through debt, obligation, and the quiet threat of ruin. Cassian inherited every one of those chains. He also inherited the cold intelligence required to maintain them. By 31, he had expanded the Dominion's wealth by 1/3. He had crushed 2 attempted secessions without ever drawing a sword. He had restructured the taxation system so thoroughly that even his enemies admitted his administrative brilliance while cursing his name in private. But brilliance was never the word people used first when they described the Duke of Blackthorn. They used other words: calculated, merciless, empty. The emptiness was the part they got wrong. Cassian was not empty. He was full of a grief so precisely maintained that it had become indistinguishable from personality. 7 years earlier, Lady Evelyn Ashford had drowned during a storm crossing on the Grey March Channel. She had been 22, Cassian had been 24. They had been together for less than a year, and in that year, he had convinced himself that she was the single irreplaceable thing the universe had offered him. Her death did not break him. That would have been too simple, too human. Instead, it reorganized him. He took the grief and compressed it into something dense and functional, a black core around which every subsequent decision orbited. He stopped sleeping in the East Wing because the light reminded him of her. He removed every portrait. He forbade her name in court. And then, with the systematic precision of a man dismantling a clock, he removed every mechanism inside himself that could produce vulnerability. What remained was effective, ruthless, and completely convinced of its own logic. The marriage to Aurelia Thornhaven was pure arithmetic. House Thornhaven controlled the Thornvale Pass, the only viable winter route between Blackthorn and the eastern provinces. For 3 generations, the Thornhavens had maintained that pass as an independent corridor, refusing to cede control to any larger house. This independence had once made them powerful. Now it made them desperate. 2 consecutive failed harvests, a collapsed mine, and a series of catastrophic trade miscalculations had left the house bleeding money. Lord Aldrich Thornhaven, Aurelia's father, had exactly 11 months of solvency remaining before creditors would begin seizing his estates. Cassian's chancellor, Lord Dravenhale, delivered the assessment with his usual surgical detachment during a morning briefing in the war room. Thornhaven is finished. The question is whether we acquire the pass through marriage or foreclosure. Cassian studied the map spread across the oak table, his fingers tracing the narrow corridor of the Thornvale Pass. Foreclosure creates a political mess. Half the eastern houses would use it as proof that we are dismantling the old families. Which we are, Draven said. Which we are doing quietly. Cassian straightened. Marriage is cleaner. A Thornhaven bride gives us the pass, silences the eastern lords, and costs us nothing except a title and a wing of the castle. The daughter is reportedly intelligent. Then she will understand the arrangement without requiring explanation. Draven hesitated. In 15 years of service, the Chancellor had learned to read the spaces between his duke's words. And if she does not? Cassian's expression did not change. Then she will learn. That was the entire courtship, 6 weeks of legal negotiation between chancellors. A single formal dinner where Cassian and Aurelia sat across from each other at a table long enough to seat 40, exchanging precisely the number of words required by protocol and not one syllable more. He noted that she had dark hair, sharp features, and a habit of watching people's hands when they spoke rather than their faces. He filed this observation under irrelevant and moved on to the tariff review. What he did not notice, what his particular species of blindness made impossible to detect, was that Aurelia watched his hands too, and she saw something in the way he gripped his wine glass that told her more about the Duke of Blackthorn than every intelligence report her father's network had compiled over 6 months of preparation. His knuckles turned white around the stem, not from anger, from the effort of holding himself perfectly still. She recognized that grip. She had seen it in soldiers who had survived sieges, in merchants who had clawed their way back from bankruptcy, in anyone who had learned to treat stillness as a form of survival. The Duke of Blackthorn was not calm. He was clenched. Every muscle, every thought, every carefully modulated word, all of it held in place by force. Aurelia said nothing about this observation. She complimented the wine instead. The wedding itself was a masterpiece of political theater. Blackthorn Cathedral blazed with light. The 1,200 guests represented every significant house in the kingdom, and each one understood that their presence was not optional. To attend was to acknowledge Cassian's dominion. To refuse was to announce opposition. Aurelia walked the stone aisle in a gown of midnight blue, not white, which had been her single demand during negotiations, and the only personal request Cassian granted because it cost him nothing. Her father walked beside her, his face carrying the particular dignity of a man who understood he was selling his daughter's future to save his family's past. He did not apologize. Aurelia did not expect him to. They had discussed the mathematics together, and she had been the one to recommend accepting the Duke's terms. "You are certain," her father had said the night before, standing in her quarters at Thornhaven Hall while servants packed her belongings into trunks. "Certainty is a luxury we lost 2 harvests ago," Aurelia replied without looking up from the inventory she was reviewing. "What I am is prepared." Prepared for what? She finally met his eyes. For whatever he actually is underneath all that architecture. The ceremony lasted 40 minutes. Cassian spoke his vows in the same tone he used for trade agreements, clear, precise, utterly devoid of emotion. Aurelia matched him. When the officiant declared them bound, the cathedral erupted in applause that sounded less like celebration than relief. The most dangerous man in the kingdom had taken a bride. Perhaps now, the unspoken consensus suggested, he would be distracted enough to leave the rest of them alone. The banquet that followed was excessive even by Valecourt standards. 7 courses, 3 orchestras rotating through the great hall, wine from cellars that had been sealed for decades. Cassian presided from the head of the table, receiving congratulations with the practiced grace of a man who had learned to simulate human warmth without ever producing the genuine article. Aurelia sat beside him and ate precisely enough to demonstrate good health and appetite. She spoke to every noble who approached. She laughed at the appropriate moments. And beneath the table, where no one could see, she pressed her thumbnail into the pad of her index finger hard enough to leave a mark. A trick she had developed in childhood to maintain absolute focus during situations that demanded performance over authenticity. The evening ended. The guests dispersed to their quarters. The corridors of Blackthorn Castle emptied until only the sound of boots on stone remained as Cassian walked toward the master suite with his new wife 3 steps behind him. He held the door. She entered. He closed it. And then, with the casual brutality of a man accustomed to delivering verdicts, the Duke of Blackthorn turned to his bride and dismantled the entire fiction of their union. "I will be direct with you," he said, "because I find dishonesty inefficient." Aurelia stood near the window, moonlight catching the sharp angles of her face. She did not sit. She did not remove her gloves. She simply waited. "This marriage is a territorial acquisition," Cassian continued. "Your family receives financial salvation. I receive the Thornvale Pass and the political cover of a suitable alliance. Those are the terms. They do not include affection, companionship, or the pretense of either. You could have included that in the contract, Aurelia said. Saved yourself the speech. Something flickered across his face. Not quite surprise, more like the registering of unexpected data. He had prepared for tears, protests, bargaining, the standard arsenal of women confronted with the architecture of their own disposability. A dry observation was not in the script. He recovered quickly. I am telling you now as a courtesy. Generous of you. And because there is one thing you need to understand clearly. He crossed to the sideboard and poured whiskey into a glass. Not 2 glasses. 1. He drank without offering. I love someone before you. I will love someone after the memory of you has faded. But I will never love you. The words landed in the room like stones dropped into still water. Aurelia watched the ripples. Her name was Evelyn, Cassian said, and for the first time something in his voice shifted. Not warmer exactly, but rawer, as though the name itself had scraped against something he kept buried. She is dead, and the part of me that was capable of what you probably imagine love to be died with her. He set the glass down. Looked at Aurelia with the flat assessment of a man reviewing property he had already decided to warehouse. I only loved her. He said it with such finality that it sounded rehearsed. Because it was. He had been rehearsing that sentence for 7 years, polishing it into a weapon, a wall, a declaration of permanent closure. Every time he said it, to himself in mirrors, to the silence of empty rooms, to the ghost he maintained like a shrine inside his own chest, it became more solid, more true, more impenetrable. Aurelia stood perfectly still through all of it. Her breathing did not change. Her expression held steady in that particular configuration of calm that could mean anything from acceptance to calculation to absolute fury held behind glass. Then she spoke. Is that all? Cassian blinked. It was a small thing, a fractional disruption in the mask he wore so well that most people had forgotten it was a mask. But Aurelia caught it. What did you expect me to say? She asked. I expected you to understand your position. Oh, I understand it. She pulled one glove off, then the other, folding them with deliberate precision. I understand that you married me because my family's collapse was cheaper to exploit than an open military campaign for the pass. I understand that you have spent the last 7 years building an identity around a dead woman because mourning is the only emotion you can control. And I understand that you delivered that little speech just now not as a warning, but as a reassurance. Reassurance. To yourself. She met his eyes. Because if you have already declared that love is impossible, then you never have to risk discovering that you are simply afraid of it. The silence that followed was not the silence of a room. It was the silence of a man hearing a sound he could not identify, something that did not fit the acoustic architecture of his carefully constructed world. Cassian's jaw tightened. You overstep. I accepted your terms, Your Grace. The pass is yours. My family survives. The political theater is complete. She walked toward the dressing chamber, pausing at the doorway. But you should know something about what you just purchased. She turned, and for the first time she smiled. Not a warm smile. Not a nervous smile. Not the placating curve that generations of political brides had offered their captors. This was something else entirely. It was the smile of a woman who had just finished reading the last page of a contract and found the loophole. You bought a Thornhaven, she said. We do not break. We do not beg. And we have never, in 300 years of recorded history, stayed where we were put. The dressing chamber door closed behind her. Cassian stood alone in the bedroom of his ancestors, holding an empty whiskey glass, and for the first time in 7 years, he felt something he could not immediately classify and suppress. He told himself it was irritation. He poured another drink. 3 weeks later, the order came. Cassian summoned his chancellor before the morning council session and delivered the instruction as though it were a routine administrative matter. I am relocating the Duchess to Ironmere Keep. Draven looked up from his documents. Ironmere. She requires her own household. Ironmere provides one. Ironmere is a ruin. The garrison was pulled 8 years ago. The nearest functioning village is a 4-hour ride. The roof of the East Tower collapsed last winter. Then she will have a project. Draven set his pen down. In 15 years, he had disagreed with his duke exactly 4 times. He chose this moment for the 5th. This will be interpreted as punishment. It is relocation. Sending the Duchess to the most desolate outpost in the Dominion 3 weeks after the wedding will be interpreted as punishment by every noble house that attended the ceremony. It suggests instability. It suggests the marriage has already fractured. The marriage functions exactly as designed. Does it? Draven's voice carried a quality that would have been dangerous from anyone of lesser rank. Then why does she need to be removed from the capital? Cassian turned from the window, and the look he gave his chancellor carried enough voltage to end the conversation. Because I require focus. The Northern tariff negotiations begin in 6 weeks, and I will not conduct them with distractions in my peripheral vision. You have never been distracted by a woman in your life, and I intend to maintain that record. The order was dispatched that afternoon. Aurelia received it in her quarters, the modest suite in the West Wing that Cassian had assigned her, far from the master chambers, far from the council rooms, far from anything that mattered. She read the document once, folded it, and handed it to her lady's maid. Have my trunks prepared by evening. My lady, Ironmere is... I know what Ironmere is. Aurelia moved to the window and looked out across the sprawling courtyards of Blackthorn Castle, the spires catching morning light, the banners snapping in the wind. All of it engineered to project permanence, dominance, the illusion that what existed now would exist forever. She had studied enough history to know that every empire that believed in its own permanence was already dying. The only question was whether it would be replaced by something better or something worse. My lady, the maid said carefully, what will you do there? Aurelia turned from the window. The expression on her face was not grief, not anger, not the shattered dignity of a woman cast aside. It was something quieter and infinitely more dangerous. It was clarity. Everything he is afraid I will do here. The carriage left Blackthorn at dawn the next morning. No ceremony, no escort beyond the minimum required by protocol. 6 mounted guards who looked embarrassed to be delivering the Duchess to what amounted to a gilded exile. Cassian did not watch her leave. He was already in the council chamber, reviewing trade projections with his ministers, his attention fixed on columns of numbers with the iron discipline of a man who had perfected the art of not looking at the things he had chosen to destroy. But Draven watched. He stood at the eastern parapet as the carriage wound down the mountain road toward the valley below, growing smaller with each switchback until it disappeared into the morning fog. The Chancellor had served 3 Valecourt rulers. He had survived 2 succession crises, a plague, and a trade war that nearly bankrupted the Dominion. He had learned to recognize the shape of catastrophe long before it announced itself. And standing on that parapet, watching the fog swallow the Duchess's carriage, Draven felt something he had not felt in decades, genuine unease, not because of what the Duke had done, because of what the Duke had failed to notice. The woman he had just exiled to a ruin at the edge of his territory was not retreating. Draven had seen her face as the carriage pulled away. He had read the inventory she requisitioned, not the belongings of a woman preparing for isolation, but the supplies of someone establishing a forward operating position. Ledgers, regional maps, agricultural surveys from the last 3 decades, a complete census of every village within 60 miles of Ironmere. The Duchess of Blackthorn had not been banished. She had been deployed. And the man who deployed her had absolutely no idea what he had just set in motion. Ironmere Keep sat on a granite shelf overlooking the river valley like a broken tooth in an old jaw. 3 towers remained standing. The 4th had surrendered to weather and neglect sometime during the previous decade. Its stones scattered down the hillside in a pattern that suggested the collapse had been slow. Not a dramatic implosion, but a quiet, seasonal erosion, one frost cycle at a time, until the structure simply stopped pretending it could hold itself together. Aurelia stepped out of the carriage and stood in the courtyard, her boots sinking into mud that had accumulated where flagstones had cracked and separated. The wind off the valley carried the smell of wet stone and something sharper underneath, mildew, rotting timber, the specific chemical signature of a place that had been breathing its own decay for years without ventilation. The 6 guards who had escorted her sat their horses in a semicircle behind the carriage, their faces arranged in variations of the same expression. Discomfort, masked as discipline. None of them wanted to be here. None of them wanted to be the soldiers remembered for delivering the Duchess to a ruin. The garrison commander, a weathered officer named Brannock, who had been stationed at Ironmere for 3 years as what amounted to a career punishment, emerged from the main hall and stopped short when he saw the carriage bearing the Valecourt crest. "Commander Brannock!" Aurelia's voice carried across the courtyard with a clarity that did not match her surroundings. "How many men do you currently have under your command?" Brannock blinked. He had expected a noblewoman stepping into exile. He had prepared a speech about accommodations and apologies. The woman standing in front of him looked like she was conducting an inspection. 14, my lady. 12 regulars and 2 scouts. And how many could this fortress hold at full garrison? 200. Maybe 250 if you pack the East Barracks. The East Barracks with the collapsed roof. Yes, my lady. Aurelia nodded. She turned a full circle, her eyes moving across the courtyard, the walls, the towers, the gate, cataloging damage with the focused attention of someone who saw problems not as obstacles but as raw material. "I will need a full structural assessment by tomorrow evening," she said. "Every wall, every roof, every cistern. I want to know what holds weight and what does not. I want to know where the water comes from and where it goes when the pipes fail. And I want a map of every village within a day's ride, with current population counts and whatever harvest data you can gather." Brannock stared at her. "My lady, I was told you were coming here to—" He stopped himself. "To what, Commander?" He had the decency to look uncomfortable. "To reside." "I am residing." She pulled her gloves off and tucked them into her belt. "I am also working. The two are not mutually exclusive, despite what the capital seems to believe." She walked past him into the keep without waiting for an escort. Brannock stood in the courtyard for a long moment, watching the doorway she had disappeared through. Then he turned to his sergeant, a heavy-set man named Corwin, who had been standing near the stables with his arms crossed. "Well," Brannock said. "Well," Corwin agreed, "that is not what I expected." "No, sir, that is not." The first month was inventory. Aurelia spent it mapping the damage, not just to Ironmere itself, but to the entire surrounding region. She rode out every morning at dawn with Brannock or one of his scouts, visiting villages that had not seen a representative of the Valecourt household in years. Some of them had not seen anyone from the capital in over a decade. What she found was not surprising. It was worse than not surprising. It was systematic. The villages closest to Ironmere had once been prosperous. Farming communities that fed the garrison, supplied timber to the fortress, maintained the roads that connected the eastern provinces to Blackthorn's trade network. When the garrison was pulled, the supply chain collapsed. Without the fortress as a hub, the roads deteriorated. Without roads, trade dried up. Without trade, the young left for the cities. Without the young, the farms contracted. A textbook cascade failure, and Aurelia recognized it because she had watched the same pattern destroy her own family's holdings before her father's debts made the decline irreversible. The difference was that Thornhaven had fallen because of bad luck and worse financial decisions. These villages had fallen because Blackthorn had abandoned them deliberately. The garrison was pulled not because of budget constraints, but because Cassian's father had redirected military resources to the northern border during a territorial dispute that ended 3 years before the old duke died. When Cassian inherited the dominion, no one had thought to mention that 14 villages in the eastern valley were slowly starving, or perhaps someone had mentioned it, and the information had been filed in the same category as everything else that did not directly affect trade revenue or political leverage. Irrelevant. Aurelia sat in Ironmere's drafty study on her 32nd night in exile, surrounded by maps and census documents and agricultural surveys, and she felt something settle into her bones that was neither anger nor grief. It was recognition. She had married into a system that treated human beings as line items on a balance sheet, and the man who ran that system was not cruel in the way that small men are cruel, petty, vindictive, gratified by suffering. He was cruel in the way that architecture is cruel, indifferent, structural, built to serve a function that had nothing to do with the people living inside it. She picked up her pen and began drafting letters. The first went to a merchant named Hadley Cask in the port city of Greymarch, a man her father had done business with for 20 years and one of the few traders in the kingdom who operated outside the Valecourt monopoly system. She did not ask for charity. She proposed a deal. Ironmere sat at the junction of two river routes that had been unused since the garrison closed. If those routes were reopened, goods could move between the eastern farms and the coastal markets without passing through Blackthorn's taxed corridors. The margins would be thin at first, but the volume would grow. The second letter went to a stonemasons guild in the town of Ashwick, 30 miles south. Ironmere's walls needed repair. The local villages had men who needed work. She proposed a labor exchange. The guild would send a master mason to supervise reconstruction, and the villages would supply workers in exchange for fair wages paid from the trade revenue once it materialized. The third letter went to no one. She wrote it to herself. A single page of observations about the Duke of Blackthorn, written in a cipher she had developed as a girl when her father's creditors began intercepting household correspondence. She wrote about power and what it actually looked like when you stripped away the banners and the battlements and the carefully maintained mythology of dominance. She wrote about a man who poured one glass of whiskey on his wedding night. She wrote about white knuckles on a glass stem. She wrote about a voice that only cracked when it said one name. And she wrote a question she could not yet answer. Is he keeping Evelyn alive because he loved her, or because losing her is the only story he knows how to tell about himself? She folded the page, sealed it, and locked it in the bottom drawer of the desk. Then she went back to the trade proposals. Reports began arriving at Blackthorn Castle 6 weeks after Aurelia's departure. They came through the standard administrative channels. Regional dispatches filed by the scouts Brannock sent to the capital on their regular rotation. Routine documents. Status updates on a forgotten outpost. Draven read them first, as he read everything first. And on the morning he finished the third report, he brought all three to Cassian's study and laid them on the desk without comment. Cassian glanced at the seal. Ironmere, your wife has reopened the river trade routes. A pause, barely perceptible. The kind of pause that, in a man like Cassian, represented the equivalent of a normal person's jaw-dropping. She has done what? The eastern river corridors, unused since your father closed the garrison. She has negotiated independent trade agreements with 3 merchant houses and redirected agricultural output from 11 villages through the river system to coastal markets. She does not have the authority to negotiate trade agreements. She is the Duchess of Blackthorn. Technically, she has exactly the authority you failed to explicitly revoke in the relocation order. Cassian's eyes moved across the reports. His reading speed was extraordinary, a skill developed through years of processing intelligence faster than his advisors could summarize it. He absorbed the contents of all 3 documents in under 2 minutes. Then he set them down and leaned back in his chair. She is using the Thornhaven merchant network. Yes. Her father's old contacts. Yes. Connections that predate our acquisition of the family. Yes. Draven waited. Which means they operate outside our standard trade oversight. She is not violating any Valecourt commercial regulations because the routes she is using were never incorporated into our regulatory framework. They were abandoned. She is building on ground we chose to leave empty. Cassian said nothing for a long time. The study was silent except for the fire in the grate and the distant sound of hammering from the courtyard below, where workers were replacing storm-damaged shingles on the barracks roof. What is she spending? Almost nothing. She has structured the arrangements as labor exchanges and deferred payment contracts. The villages provide workforce. The merchants provide initial capital. Revenue is split on a sliding scale that favors the villages in the first 2 years and normalizes afterward. Draven allowed himself the smallest trace of professional admiration. It is, if I am being objective, an elegant economic model. It is insubordination. It is development of neglected territory using resources we were not employing. If you frame it as insubordination, every Eastern lord will frame it as proof that Blackthorn abandons its own people. She will become a martyr, and you will become the tyrant who punished his wife for feeding villages you forgot existed. Cassian's fingers drummed once on the desk. A single percussive burst, then stillness. What are you recommending? I am recommending that you do nothing. Nothing. She is generating revenue in a region that has cost us money for a decade. She is stabilizing a population that was hemorrhaging toward the cities, and she is doing it quietly, without challenging your authority publicly. If anything, it reflects well on the duchy. The Duke's wife, restoring prosperity to the eastern provinces. It is a narrative that benefits you. Unless the narrative changes, Draven met his eyes. Unless the narrative changes. Yes. Cassian stood and walked to the window. Below, the city of Blackthorn spread across the valley. Rooftops, smoke, the organized geometry of a capital that had been planned and maintained by generations of men who believed that control was the highest form of governance. He thought about Ironmere. He had been there once, years ago, during a hunting expedition that used the fortress as a way station. He remembered the crumbling walls, the empty barracks, the way the wind moved through broken windows with a sound like something breathing in its sleep. He had noted the disrepair and moved on, filed it under the same category as everything else that existed outside the radius of his immediate strategic concerns. And now his wife was turning that ruin into something that people talked about. The thing Cassian understood about power, the thing his father had taught him before the old man's heart gave out in the middle of a council session, was that it did not reside in castles or armies or even wealth. It resided in narrative. Whoever controlled the story controlled the outcome. His entire dominion was built on a story, the story that Valecourt authority was absolute, inevitable, and permanent. Every contract, every taxation structure, every military deployment reinforced that story. Aurelia was writing a different story. Not louder. Not in opposition. Just different. A story in which things grew without being commanded, in which loyalty was earned rather than inherited, in which a woman exiled to a ruin could build something that functioned without the permission of the man who exiled her. That was the part that settled into his chest like a splinter he could not locate. Not that she was succeeding, that she had not asked. Send additional scouts to Ironmere, Cassian said without turning from the window. I want weekly reports, detailed, financial, military, and political. Every meeting she takes, every contract she signs, every message she sends. You are putting your wife under surveillance. I am monitoring a regional development initiative. Draven collected the reports from the desk. He paused at the door. Your Grace. What? Lady Evelyn never frightened you. The temperature in the room dropped by several degrees, not physically, but the quality of the silence changed into something that carried weight, and Draven felt it press against his sternum like a hand. Leave, Cassian said. Draven left, and Cassian stood at the window long after the door closed, watching the city below without seeing it, because his mind was 60 miles east in a crumbling fortress where a woman he had tried to erase was building something he could not name and could not stop, and this was the part that made his jaw tighten until the muscles ached. Did not want to stop. He poured a drink. One glass. Held it without drinking. Thought about white knuckles. 4 months into her exile, Aurelia stood in the rebuilt market square of Thornfield, the largest of the 11 villages she had incorporated into the Ironmere trade network, and watched a woman sell bread. It was an ordinary transaction. A farmer's wife exchanging coin for a loaf. The bread was fresh, baked that morning in an oven that had been cold for 3 years because the baker had left for Greymarch when his customers could no longer afford his prices. He had returned 2 months ago after Aurelia's trade routes brought enough commerce back to the village to make baking viable again. The farmer's wife bit into the bread as she walked away. A small gesture. Unremarkable. But Aurelia watched it with an intensity that Brannock, standing beside her, found unsettling. My lady? Do you know what kills a village, Commander? Brannock considered the question. Poverty, disease, bad harvests. No. Aurelia kept her eyes on the market. What kills a village is when people stop believing it will exist next year. A farmer can survive a bad harvest. He cannot survive the certainty that no harvest will ever be good again. That woman just bought bread because she believes there will be bread tomorrow. That is not commerce. That is the decision to stay. You sound like you have watched this before. I grew up in it. She turned to face him. Thornhaven did not collapse because of debt. Debt is a number. Thornhaven collapsed because my father stopped making decisions as though the future existed. Once that belief disappears from a household, a village, a dominion, the structures remain, but the life inside them is already gone. Brannick absorbed this. He had served in the Valecourt military for 22 years, and in that time he had heard exactly one type of speech from the ruling family, commands delivered with the assumption that the world would rearrange itself to comply. What the Duchess was doing was something different. She was describing reality as though she had lived inside it rather than above it. "The Duke does not see it this way," Brannick said carefully. "The Duke sees what his reports tell him to see, and his reports are written by people who have been trained to describe the world in terms of control and compliance." She watched a group of children running between market stalls, their laughter carrying across the square. "No one ever sends a report that says the villages are dying of despair. They say the villages are underperforming revenue targets. Same catastrophe, different language. The language determines whether anyone bothers to intervene." That evening, Aurelia received a letter from Draven, official correspondence bearing the Chancellor's personal seal. The contents were precisely what she expected. The Duke acknowledged the economic developments in the eastern region. The Duke commended her initiative. The Duke requested a formal accounting of all trade agreements, revenue projections, and labor arrangements for review by the Treasury Council. Aurelia read the letter twice. Then she drafted her response, a comprehensive financial summary that gave Cassian's treasury exactly enough data to confirm that everything was functioning within legal parameters and not one detail more. She understood what the letter really meant. The request for accounting was not administrative. It was cartographic. Cassian was mapping her operation, identifying its structure, its dependencies, its vulnerabilities. He was doing what the Valecourt dynasty had always done when confronted with something it did not build, studying it until he understood it well enough to either absorb it or dismantle it. Aurelia sealed the response and handed it to the courier. Then she sat at her desk in the study that no longer smelled of mildew because she had personally supervised the replacement of every rotting beam in the ceiling, and she opened the bottom drawer, and she unfolded the ciphered page she had written on her first night at Ironmere. She read her own question again. Is he keeping Eveline alive because he loved her, or because losing her is the only story he knows how to tell about himself? She picked up her pen. Below the question, in the same careful cipher, she added a second line. He is afraid. Not of me, of finding out the answer. She locked the drawer. Outside the window, the valley spread beneath a sky streaked with the last copper light of sunset. The villages along the river were lit, not the scattered failing glow of a dying region, but the steady light of kitchens and workshops and market halls operating past dusk because there was enough business to justify the candle cost. She had built this, not with armies, not with contracts that chained people to debts they could never repay, not with the particular brand of inherited dominance that the Valecourt name had wielded for generations like a weapon disguised as governance. She had built it by asking people what they needed and then getting out of their way. And somewhere in Blackthorn Castle, 60 miles west, the most powerful man in the kingdom was reading her financial summaries and finding no errors, no violations, no grounds for intervention, and that absence was driving him closer to Ironmere than any provocation ever could. Because Cassian Valecourt understood enemies. He had been raised on enemies. Enemies were the foundation of every strategy he had ever deployed. Identify the threat, quantify the risk, neutralize the opposition. But Aurelia was not an enemy. She was an answer to a question he had not known he was asking. And that was so much worse. The writer arrived at Ironmere on a Tuesday, just before dusk. He bore the Duke's personal seal, not the administrative crest of the Chancellor's office, not the military dispatch of the garrison command, but the private emblem of Cassian Valecourt himself. Aurelia recognized it immediately. In 9 months of exile, she had received dozens of official communications from Blackthorn. Not one had carried this seal. Brannick brought the message to her study. She broke the wax without ceremony, 4 lines. Cassian's handwriting, angular, compressed, every letter formed with the aggressive efficiency of a man who resented the time it took to commit words to paper. I will arrive at Ironmere within the fortnight. Prepare appropriate accommodations. This visit is not diplomatic. Do not inform the Chancellor. Aurelia read the note 3 times. Not because the words were complex, because the last sentence changed everything. Do not inform the Chancellor. In 9 months, every communication between Cassian and Ironmere had traveled through Draven's office. Every report, every financial summary, Every administrative directive had been filtered through the Chancellor's meticulous oversight. Draven was not merely an advisor, he was the membrane between the Duke and the world, the mechanism through which Cassian maintained the distance he required to function, and now Cassian was bypassing him. Aurelia set the note down. She walked to the window and looked out at Ironmere's restored courtyard, where the stonemasons were finishing the last section of the rebuilt southern wall. The scaffolding would come down within the week. The fortress that Cassian had sent her to as a punishment was nearly whole again. She pressed her palms flat against the stone sill and closed her eyes and listened to the sound of hammers ringing against new mortar. And she felt her heartbeat in her wrist, steady, deliberate, the rhythm of a woman who had spent 9 months preparing for a moment she had known was inevitable without ever knowing when it would arrive. He was coming. Not the Duke, not the administrator, not the political strategist who communicated through chancellors and dispatches and the controlled architecture of power. The man, the one who poured one glass on his wedding night, the one whose knuckles went white, the one who had built an entire identity around a dead woman because the alternative was admitting that he had survived and did not know what to do with the rest of his life. That man was riding toward Ironmere, and he was coming alone. And he had told no one. And that combination of facts meant only one thing. He had lost control of the story. And a man like Cassian, stripped of the narrative that held him together, was either about to rebuild himself or burn down everything within reach. Aurelia opened her eyes. The courtyard below was bathed in the last light of a day that would not return. Workers moved between scaffolds. Carts loaded with riverstone rumbled through the gate. The steady industry of a place that had chosen to exist again filled the air with noise and purpose, and the accumulated evidence of 9 months of relentless, quiet defiance. She turned from the window. She did not smile. She had moved past smiling approximately 6 months ago, around the time she realized that what she was building at Ironmere was not leverage, not a bargaining position, not a political counterweight to a husband who had tried to erase her. It was a mirror, and the Duke of Blackthorn was about to ride 60 miles to stand in front of it. Whether he could survive what he saw there was a question that not even Aurelia, with all her clarity, all her planning, all her 300 years of Thornhaven resilience, could answer. Cassian rode through the gates of Ironmere Keep on the 11th day, 4 days ahead of the schedule his letter had specified. He brought no escort, no banners, no advance party to announce the Duke's arrival and rearrange the world into the configuration he preferred. Just a single horse, road-worn and lathered, and a man who had not slept properly in 6 days because every time he closed his eyes, he saw financial summaries that contained no errors, and that absence kept gnawing at something behind his sternum that he could not reach. He had left Blackthorn at midnight, telling only the stablemaster he was riding for the Northern Hunting Lodge, a lie so ordinary that no one questioned it. Dukes rode to hunting lodges. Dukes did not ride 60 miles east to visit wives they had exiled to ruins, and certainly not alone, and certainly not with the coiled, dangerous energy of a man who had realized he was losing a war he never agreed to fight. The courtyard stopped him. Not physically, but the sight of it. New stone fitted against old scaffolding freshly removed, a working stable with 8 horses where there had been none, a well with a functioning pulley system, carts being loaded for morning market runs. The sight of it created a sensation in his chest that was close to vertigo. He had sent her here to disappear. The place was supposed to match the sentence. Crumbling walls for a discarded wife. Silence for a woman who had said too much on her wedding night. Instead, Ironmere was alive. Brannick met him in the courtyard. The commander's salute was correct but unhurried, which told Cassian something about the chain of loyalty that had developed in this place over 9 months. "Your Grace, we were not expecting you until Thursday." "Where's the Duchess?" "The Eastern Granary. She is supervising the last inventory before the river shipment tomorrow." Cassian dismounted and handed the reins to a stable hand who looked at the Duke of Blackthorn with the polite disinterest of a man who answered to someone else now. He found her in the granary, a long stone building that smelled of dried wheat and sawdust, its shelves stacked with sacks bearing the stamps of 11 different villages. Aurelia stood at a work table covered in ledgers, speaking with a heavy-set man Cassian did not recognize, a merchant, judging by the quality of his coat and the ink stains on his fingers. They were arguing about shipping weights with the focused aggression of two people who had conducted enough business together to skip courtesy. Aurelia saw Cassian in the doorway. Her hands did not stop moving across the ledger page. Her voice did not change. She finished her sentence to the merchant, marked a figure, closed the book, and looked up. "You are early. I am the Duke of Blackthorn. I arrive when I choose." "And yet you chose to arrive before your own schedule, which suggests the schedule was never the point." She turned to the merchant. "Hadley, we will finish in the morning." The merchant, Hadley Cask, Cassian realized, the Thornhaven trade contact from the intelligence reports, collected his papers and left with a nod to Aurelia and a careful, measured bow to Cassian that communicated respect without deference. The distinction was deliberate. Cassian registered it the way a swordsman registers the weight of an unfamiliar blade. They were alone. The granary was dim, lit by oil lamps hung from iron hooks along the walls. The light caught the planes of Aurelia's face, and Cassian noticed, hated himself for noticing, that 9 months of physical labor and outdoor administration had changed her. The sharp features he remembered from the wedding had weathered into something harder, more defined, the way metal changes when it has been worked. She looked like someone who belonged in this place, like someone who had earned the stone under her boots. "Walk with me," she said. Not a request, not a command. Something between the two that carried an authority he had not granted. He walked. She led him through the fortress, and what she showed him was not a tour. It was testimony. Every restored corridor, every functioning workshop, every repaired wall was evidence of a verdict she had been assembling for 9 months. She did not narrate. She did not explain. She simply walked, and he followed, and the silence between them filled with the accumulated weight of everything she had built while he sat in his castle reading reports that reduced all of this to numbers on a page. They ended on the northern parapet, overlooking the river valley. Below, the villages glowed in the gathering dusk. Not the desperate fading light of a dying region, the steady, practical illumination of places that had decided to continue. Cassian stood at the battlement and looked at what his wife had made from the wreckage he gave her, and inside him something shifted, not dramatically, not with the clean narrative arc of a man experiencing revelation, more like a geological event. A deep plate moving against another deep plate, slow and enormous and irreversible, and the pressure of it made his breathing shallow. "Why did you come?" Aurelia said. He did not answer immediately. The Duke of Blackthorn had built a life on immediate answers, decisive, controlled, never revealing the machinery behind the response. But standing on this parapet, looking at this valley, standing next to this woman who had taken his punishment and converted it into something that made his entire dominion look negligent by comparison, he could not find the script. "I read every report," he said finally, "every dispatch, every financial summary. For 9 months I have read everything that came out of this place. I know. Draven's surveillance operation was not subtle." He turned his head. "You knew about the surveillance. Commander Brannick identified your additional scouts within the first week. He offered to have them intercepted. I told him to let them observe. I had nothing to hide." The simplicity of it landed like a slap. 9 months of covert intelligence gathering, and she had known from the beginning and simply let him watch. "You could have protested, filed a formal objection with the council." "I could have, but a protest would have given you what you wanted, evidence of opposition. Something to respond to, something to control." She rested her hands on the battlement. "I find it more productive to let people reveal themselves through their own actions rather than provoking them into performing." Cassian's jaw worked. He could feel the muscles tightening along the hinge, the familiar clench that preceded the cold surgical responses that had ended 100 negotiations in his favor. But the response did not come. The mechanism that converted pressure into dominance, that transmuted vulnerability into command, that machinery was stalling, and the silence it left behind was terrifying. "I came because the reports did not make sense," he said. "They were accurate." "I know they were accurate. That is what did not make sense." He gripped the stone. The cold of it bit into his palms, and he welcomed the sensation because it was concrete, external, something he could process. "You were given nothing, less than nothing. A ruin and a skeleton garrison and a region that had been bleeding for a decade. And you built this without resources, without authority, without you. The two words hit him center mass. He stopped breathing for a count of 3. And in that interval, the part of him that had spent 7 years constructing an identity around loss and control recognized the sound of its own foundation cracking. Yes, he said. His voice was rough. Without me. They stood in silence for a long time. The valley darkened. Lights multiplied below as households lit their evening lamps. Each one a small declaration of permanence, and the cumulative effect was a landscape that looked like it was breathing. I did not love Evelyn, Cassian said. Aurelia did not react. She had the stillness of someone who had been waiting for a specific sentence and recognized it the instant it arrived. I loved losing her. I loved the wound. I loved having something that hurt enough to justify every wall I built and every person I kept at a distance and every decision I made that treated human beings like entries in a ledger. His hands were white on the stone. The grief was not a burden. It was a strategy, and I have used it for 7 years to avoid becoming someone who could be hurt again. He turned to face her. In the lamplight, his expression was stripped, not vulnerable in the performed way that powerful men sometimes adopt when they want to simulate depth, but actually exposed. The musculature of his control peeled back to reveal the raw, frightened architecture underneath. I only loved her because she was gone, he said. And now He stopped. Swallowed. The next word was the most dangerous thing he had ever attempted. More dangerous than any political maneuver, any military decision, any calculated risk in a career built on calculated risks. Because this word could not be taken back and could not be controlled and would change the geometry of everything. And now I love you. Aurelia's breathing changed. A single alteration, deeper, held half a beat longer, that someone less attentive than Cassian would have missed. But he had spent 9 months reading reports about this woman, and he had memorized the rhythm of her language and the pattern of her thinking. And now, standing close enough to hear her breathe, he was calibrating her the way he calibrated everything. Except for the first time in his life, he was doing it not to gain advantage, but because he was desperate to know if the words had landed. She looked at him for a long time. Then she said, I need to think about what that means. He nodded. The nod cost him more than any concession he had ever made at a negotiating table. Stay the night, she said. There are things I want to show you in the morning. How the villages operate, what the trade network looks like from the ground instead of from a report. I will stay. She left the parapet. He listened to her footsteps on the stone stairs until they faded, and then he stood alone above the valley, gripping the battlement, breathing the cold air, and feeling the entire interior structure of his identity rearrange itself around a new center of gravity. He did not sleep. He sat in the guest chamber Brannick had prepared, a room that was modest and clean and bore no trace of luxury because Ironmere did not waste resources on display. And he stared at the ceiling, and he felt something he had not felt since he was 24 years old, and standing on the dock at Greymarch, waiting for a ship that would never arrive. Hope. Specific, directed, conditional hope. The most dangerous substance a man like Cassian could ingest. He arrived in Ironmere's courtyard at dawn the next morning and found it already in motion. Workers loading carts. Brannick conferring with scouts. The merchant Hadley reviewing shipping manifests near the gate. Aurelia was not there. Brannick approached with a face that had changed since the previous evening. The easy competence was gone. In its place was something Cassian recognized from decades of reading subordinates in crisis, the particular rigidity of a soldier who has received bad news and is processing whether to deliver it. What happened? Brannick handed him a sealed document. This arrived an hour ago. Rider from Blackthorn, bearing the Chancellor's seal. Cassian broke the seal. The document was not a letter. It was a legal instrument, an order of annulment and asset reclamation, drafted in the precise, lethal language of Blackthorn's highest legal authority and bearing the counter-signatures of 11 noble houses. He read it once, then again. The second reading was slower because his vision had narrowed to a point, and the words seemed to move on the page like insects. The order stated that the Duchess of Blackthorn had exceeded her legal authority by negotiating independent trade agreements without ducal authorization, that she had appropriated crown resources, specifically the river trade routes, for personal commercial benefit, that she had established a parallel governance structure in the eastern provinces that constituted sedition, and that, as a remedy, the marriage was to be annulled, Aurelia was to be stripped of her title, and all assets, agreements, and structures she had developed at Ironmere were to be seized and transferred to the ducal treasury. The countersignatures belonged to the Eastern lords, every one of them. Houses that Cassian had assumed were neutral at worst, sympathetic at best. At the bottom of the document, in a hand Cassian had read 10,000 times over 15 years of partnership, was the Chancellor's authorizing signature, Draven Hale. Cassian lowered the document. His hands were steady. His breathing was even. But inside, in the space behind the sternum where the new and fragile thing had started to take root less than 12 hours ago, something was burning. Where is Draven now? The writer said the Chancellor departed Blackthorn 2 days ago with a legal delegation and a military escort of 40 men. He expects to arrive at Ironmere by midday. He departed before this document was delivered. Yes, Your Grace. Cassian looked at the order again. The timeline assembled itself with hideous clarity. Draven had drafted this document while Cassian was on the road to Ironmere. The Chancellor had known about the visit, had somehow intercepted the information despite Cassian's instruction to bypass his office, and had used the Duke's absence from the capital to convene the Eastern Lords, secure their signatures, and set the legal machinery in motion before Cassian could intervene. Draven had not betrayed him impulsively. This was architecture. Weeks of preparation. Months of positioning. The countersignatures alone required individual negotiations with 11 separate houses, each one a sovereign political entity with its own agenda. Draven had managed all of it without triggering a single warning in Cassian's intelligence network, which meant the intelligence network answered to Draven now, which meant it had answered to Draven for longer than Cassian wanted to calculate. He walked into the keep, found Aurelia in the study. She was already reading a copy of the annulment order. Brannick had delivered one to her first, which told Cassian something else about where the commander's loyalty resided, and at this particular moment he was grateful for it. Aurelia's face was controlled, but her hands, resting on the desk on either side of the document, were pressed flat against the wood with a pressure that whitened her fingertips. She was holding herself in place, keeping her body anchored because the ground had just been removed from under her. He has the Eastern Lords, she said, all 11. The trade agreements I built, the revenue flowing through the river routes, the village recovery. All of it gave the Eastern houses an economic stake in Ironmere's operation. Draven is offering them direct control of that stake by eliminating me and absorbing everything into ducal oversight that he manages. He is not absorbing it into ducal oversight. He is absorbing it into his oversight. Cassian's voice was flat. A blade laid on a table. This is not about annulling a marriage. This is about restructuring the power base. If this order stands, Draven controls the Eastern revenue stream, the loyalty of 11 noble houses, and the legal precedent to override ducal authority through council action. He is removing you. He is making me irrelevant. There is a difference. Removing a duke creates a succession crisis. Making a duke irrelevant simply redirects power through different channels, while the title remains as decoration. Aurelia looked up from the document. How long? Cassian knew what she was asking. Not how long until Draven arrived. How long had the betrayal been in motion? He thought about 15 years of service, 15 years of morning briefings and evening reports, and the quiet, efficient management of an empire by a man who never raised his voice and never missed a detail, and never once gave Cassian reason to question the absolute reliability of his loyalty. He thought about Draven standing at the eastern parapet, watching Aurelia's carriage disappear into fog. He thought about the Chancellor's hesitation during conversations, the pauses Cassian had interpreted as caution, but now recognized as calculation. Years, Cassian said, not this specific operation, but the positioning, the relationships with the Eastern Lords, the infiltration of the intelligence network. Years. The word tasted like iron in his mouth. Years of sitting across from a man he trusted with the machinery of his entire dominion, and the machinery had been quietly rewired to serve a different operator. The betrayal was not a knife in the back. It was the discovery that the floor he had been standing on was not solid ground, but a bridge someone else had built and could retract at any time. Every ruler in history who fell to betrayal fell the same way, not because they failed to see the threat, because they could not imagine that the foundation they stood on was the threat. You guard the walls, you watch the gates, you monitor every external enemy with the paranoid discipline that surviving in power demands. And while you are looking outward, the man who manages your walls, who controls your gates, who runs the very system you rely on to detect danger, that man reorganizes the architecture until the castle you live in belongs to him. Cassian had taught himself to survive by controlling everything, and the instrument of that control had been Draven, which meant that for 15 years Cassian's survival had been contingent on the loyalty of a single man. And loyalty, unlike contracts, could not be audited. "He will be here by midday," Aurelia said. "Yes. With 40 soldiers and a legal delegation and the signatures of 11 houses." "Yes." "And you came here alone." The observation landed without accusation. She was not blaming him, she was establishing the tactical reality. The Duke of Blackthorn, the most powerful man in the kingdom, was standing in a restored ruin with a skeleton garrison of 14 men, facing a chancellor who had spent years building the machinery to replace him, and the only person in the room who had seen this coming, who had understood from the beginning that the structures Cassian worshipped were already compromised, was the wife he had tried to erase. Cassian looked at Aurelia. She looked back. And in the space between them, unspoken but fully understood by both, was the recognition that everything he had been, the calculated ruler, the grief-armored duke, the man who treated emotion as inefficiency and people as instruments, all of it had led to this exact moment of catastrophic exposure. His power had not protected him. His control had not saved him. His walls had not kept the enemy out because the enemy had been building those walls alongside him for 15 years. "I have 6 hours," Cassian said. "We have 6 hours." He looked at her. The word we sat in the air between them like something newly born and already under siege. "You should leave," he said. "Take Brannick and as many men as will follow. The annulment strips your title, but it does not mandate your detention. If you ride for Grey March now, you can reach the coast before Draven can dispatch pursuit." "And do what?" "Become a refugee from a political collapse. Spend the rest of my life as the Duchess who fled." Aurelia stood. The document lay on the desk behind her, like a body she had finished examining. "I did not build Ironmere to have somewhere to run from. This is not about Ironmere anymore. It was never about Ironmere." Her voice cut through the room. "It was about whether a single institution, a single dynasty, a single man can survive by controlling everything around him while refusing to trust anyone inside the system he built. The answer is no. Draven is the proof. You delegated your power to a man you never questioned, because questioning him would have required the kind of vulnerability you spent 7 years surgically removing from yourself." The words hit bone. Cassian felt them land in the place where, 12 hours ago, he had spoken the most dangerous sentence of his life on a parapet above a valley full of lights. "I love you." He had said it, he had meant it, and now the universe was answering with the specific cruelty it reserved for men who opened themselves too late. "What do you propose?" he said. Aurelia walked to the window. Below, the courtyard was beginning to stir with the first routines of a normal day. Workers who did not yet know that the legal framework for everything they had built was riding toward them with 40 armed men. "Draven's entire strategy depends on one assumption," she said, "that you will respond the way you have always responded, with control, with force, with the mechanisms of dominance that define the Valecourt dynasty. He is prepared for that, Duke. Every countersignature, every legal instrument, every military positioning assumes that Cassian Valecourt will try to reassert authority through the existing power structure. Because that is what the existing power structure is designed for." Exactly. And Draven controls that structure now, which means every tool you reach for is already in his hands. She turned from the window. "So stop reaching. You are telling me to surrender. I am telling you to become someone Draven has not prepared for." She crossed the room and stood in front of him, close enough that he could see the pulse in her throat, steady and deliberate. You have 6 hours to decide what you are willing to lose. Not territory, not wealth, not political leverage. Those are already gone. Draven took them while you were reading reports and pouring whiskey in empty rooms. She held his eyes. I am asking what you are willing to lose from the inside. The identity, the armor, the version of yourself that made Draven's betrayal possible because it required a ruler who trusted systems more than people. Cassian stood in the cold morning light of a fortress his wife had rebuilt from the ruin he condemned her to, and he understood with absolute searing clarity that the next 6 hours would determine not just his political survival, but the fundamental question of whether the man he had been for 31 years could die fast enough for something else to take his place. Draven was riding toward Ironmere with the legal authority to dismantle everything. The old Cassian would have met him with force, but force was exactly what Draven expected. And for the first time in his life, the Duke of Blackthorn needed to become something his enemies had never calculated for. Something his allies had never witnessed. Something that even Aurelia, with all her clarity, could only describe in the negative. Not this, not the man you were, not the ruler who built walls and called them governance. The sun climbed higher, the clock ran, and somewhere on the road between Blackthorn and Ironmere, 40 soldiers escorted a chancellor who believed he had already won because he had spent 15 years learning exactly who Cassian Valecourt was. He had never bothered to learn who Cassian Valecourt could become. That miscalculation was about to cost him everything. Or it was about to cost Cassian everything. In 6 hours, the difference between those two outcomes would come down to a single choice that no contract, no army, no inherited power, and no carefully maintained grief could make for him. The first hour, Cassian spent motionless. He stood in Ironmere's study with both hands flat on the desk where the annulment order lay, like a surgical instrument waiting for the patient to hold still, and he did not move. Aurelia had left the room. Brannick had posted sentries on the eastern road. The fortress was waking around him. The sounds of a normal morning, workers and carts, and the rhythmic strike of a blacksmith's hammer. And none of it penetrated because the man standing at that desk was not listening to the world outside. He was listening to the sound of his own architecture collapsing. 15 years. He kept circling back to the number. 15 years of morning briefings. 15 years of Draven's measured voice presenting information with the clinical detachment that Cassian had always mistaken for loyalty. Every intelligence report, every financial summary, every strategic recommendation, all of it filtered through a man who had been quietly rebuilding the machinery of the Dominion to serve himself. And Cassian had not seen it. That was the part that made the muscles along his jaw ache, not the betrayal itself. Betrayal was a known variable in political systems, a risk that could be quantified and mitigated. What destroyed something inside him was the realization that he had been incapable of seeing it because seeing it would have required the one skill he had spent 7 years amputating from his own psychology. Trust required vulnerability. Vulnerability required the admission that you could be wrong about the people closest to you. And Cassian had eliminated that admission so thoroughly that he had become the perfect target, a man who controlled everything except the single relationship he never questioned because questioning it would have cracked the foundation of his entire operating system. Draven had understood this, had probably understood it from the beginning, had watched Cassian seal himself inside an armor of grief and control and strategic detachment, and had recognized what that armor actually was. Not protection, but blindness. A man who trusts no one trusts the wrong person completely because the energy that should distribute across 100 relationships concentrates in the single channel he leaves open. Cassian had closed every door except Draven's, and Draven had walked through it carrying 15 years of carefully assembled leverage. The second hour, Cassian moved. He walked to the courtyard where Brannick was organizing the garrison into something resembling a defensive posture. 14 men checking weapons, reinforcing the gate, positioning themselves along the walls with the grim efficiency of soldiers who knew the numbers were absurd, but had decided to stand anyway. "Commander!" Brannick turned. The man's face was steady, but his eyes carried a question he was too disciplined to ask. How many of Draven's 40 are career soldiers, and how many are household guard? Based on the writer's description, I would estimate 30 career military, 10 household. The household men will be Draven's personal detail, loyal to his pay, not to the crown. And the 30 career soldiers, who do they follow? The chain of command, Your Grace. They follow the highest legal authority present. Right now, that is the Chancellor's office bearing a council-endorsed order. And if the highest legal authority changes, Brannick's eyes sharpened, then the chain of command adjusts. Cassian looked across the courtyard. The workers had stopped loading carts. They stood in clusters, watching the garrison's preparations with the particular alertness of civilians who had survived enough instability to recognize the shape of it. These were not Blackthorn aristocrats insulated by wealth and position. These were farmers, masons, merchants, people who had rebuilt their lives on the foundation Aurelia had created, and who understood with gut-level clarity that the approaching column represented the destruction of everything they had recovered. Those workers, Cassian said, how many of them are former military? In this region, a fair number. The eastern provinces supplied a third of the Dominion's infantry for 2 generations. When the garrisons closed, the veterans went back to farming. How many could fight? Fight a trained military escort with farming tools and construction hammers. Brannick shook his head. Your Grace, I will not arm civilians against professional soldiers. Whatever happens here today happens with the men I have. 14 men against 40, against 30. The 10 household guards will fold if the military contingent shifts. Mercenaries always read the room. And the 30? The 30 will do what soldiers do, follow orders. The question is whose orders they will be following when the dust settles. Cassian held the commander's gaze. There was something in Brannick's face that he had not seen in a subordinate in years. Not fear, not calculation, not the performance of loyalty that Blackthorn's court had perfected into an art form. It was something raw, the steady, undecorated commitment of a man who had chosen his side and intended to stay there regardless of the math. You are loyal to the Duchess, Cassian said. Not a question. I am loyal to what she built here, which is more than any duke has built in this region in my lifetime. Brannick's voice was level, respectfully. Cassian absorbed the blow. He deserved it, every syllable of it. And the fact that he could recognize that, could stand in a courtyard being told by a garrison commander that his wife had accomplished more with a ruin and 14 men than the Valecourt dynasty had accomplished with armies and treasuries, meant that whatever was happening inside him was real. The plates were moving. The old architecture was coming apart. And what emerged from the wreckage would either be strong enough to survive the next 4 hours, or it would be nothing at all. I'm not going to fight Draven, Cassian said. Brannick's expression did not change, but his weight shifted, the subtle redistribution of a soldier recalculating. I need the great hall cleared, every table except 1, every chair except 12, and I need the courtyard gates open when the Chancellor arrives. Open. Wide open. No defensive posture. No armed men on the walls. Your garrison stands down. Your Grace, he is coming with the legal authority to dismantle this place. If I meet him with swords, I confirm every accusation in that document. An unstable duke protecting a seditious wife through military force. He wins before the first blade clears its sheath. And if he does not come to negotiate? He will negotiate. Draven has never wanted blood. He wants architecture. He wants the system redesigned with himself at the center. Killing me creates a succession crisis that benefits no one. He needs me alive and legally diminished. A duke in name, a figurehead in practice. Cassian's voice was stripped of its usual polish. He sounded like a man describing the mechanism of his own execution with clinical accuracy. He will negotiate because negotiation is how you steal an empire without anyone calling it theft. Brannick studied him for a long moment. Then he nodded once and turned to give orders. Cassian watched him go. Then he climbed the stairs to the northern parapet. The same parapet where, 12 hours ago, he had told his wife he loved her and felt the world shift on its axis. The valley spread below in morning light. The villages along the river were beginning their daily routines, smoke from chimneys. The distant sound of a market bell. The ordinary, persistent machinery of lives being lived. He thought about what Aurelia had said. Become someone Draven has not prepared for. For 31 years, Cassian Valecourt had been one thing, a controller. A man who held the reins of every system he touched, who managed risk by eliminating variables, who survived by ensuring that nothing, no person, no emotion, no event, could reach him without passing through filters he had designed. That man was exactly who Draven expected to face in 4 hours. And that man would lose, because that man's weapons were already in the enemy's hands. So the question was not tactical, it was existential. Could Cassian Valecourt stop being the only version of himself he had ever known? Could he dismantle 31 years of identity construction in 4 hours? And if he did? If he tore down the walls he had built around his own psychology with the same ruthless efficiency he had used to build them, would whatever remained be strong enough to survive what was coming? Or would he simply be a man without armor in a room full of blades? He did not know. That was the answer. He did not know. And for a man who had built his life on the elimination of uncertainty, the admission was either the beginning of something new or the final stage of total collapse. He gripped the parapet and breathed the cold air and felt his heartbeat in his palms, and he made a choice. Not a strategic choice. A human one. He went to find Aurelia. She was in the granary, packing documents into a lockbox. Not fleeing, organizing. Separating the financial records into categories with the methodical focus of someone who understood that information was the only weapon that could not be confiscated by force. The trade agreements, Cassian said from the doorway. How many of them are bound to you personally versus bound to the Ironmere operation? She looked up. All of them are bound to me. I negotiated every contract under my own name, not the Valecourt title. Draven's annulment strips me of the title. It does not void private commercial agreements between Lady Aurelia Thornhaven and independent merchant houses. He knows this. Of course he knows this, which means his real objective is not the annulment. It is forcing me to surrender the contracts under duress, a legal threat severe enough to make voluntary transfer look like the safer option. And if you refuse, then he escalates, detains me, fabricates criminal charges, sedition, misappropriation of crown resources, treason. He has 11 counter-signatures. He can construct any narrative he wants. Cassian crossed the room. Give me the contracts. Aurelia's hands went still on the lockbox. Why? Because in 3 hours, I'm going to sit across a table from the man who dismantled my dominion from the inside, and I am going to do something I have never done in my life. Which is? Surrender. The word hung in the granary's dusty air. Aurelia searched his face with the precision of a woman who had learned to read powerful men the way cartographers read terrain. Not the surface features, but the underlying geology that determined where the ground would hold and where it would give way. You do not surrender, she said. The Duke of Blackthorn does not surrender. That is the problem. That is the exact calculation Draven is relying on. Cassian's voice was low, intense, vibrating with something that sounded like conviction being born in real time. He expects me to fight, to invoke ducal authority, to threaten military response. He has prepared counters for every move the Duke of Blackthorn would make because he has spent 15 years studying the Duke of Blackthorn. And what will he face instead? A man who walks into a room and admits publicly, in front of his chancellor, his military escort, and the legal delegation representing 11 noble houses, that his entire system of governance was a failure, that his dominion was maintained through coercion, that the contracts binding the noble houses to Valecourt authority are instruments of control, not partnership, and that he is dissolving them. Aurelia stopped breathing. He could see it. The cessation of movement in her chest, the widening of her eyes by a fraction, that on her controlled features was the equivalent of someone else's gasp. You will destroy the Valecourt power structure. Draven is already destroying it. He is just rearranging the pieces with himself at the center. I am proposing something different. I am proposing we scatter the pieces so completely that no one, not Draven, not the Eastern Lords, not any future chancellor, can reassemble them. The hereditary obligations, the debt contracts, the binding agreements that chain every noble house to Blackthorn. All of them? That is everything your family built for 6 generations. My family built a prison and called it an empire, and I staffed that prison with a warden who turned out to be running his own operation inside the walls. Cassian held her eyes. I cannot out-control Draven. He has already won that game. But I can change the game entirely. If there is no empire to seize, there is nothing to seize it with. The nobility will turn on you. Some of them. the ones who benefited from the old system. But the Eastern Lords signed Draven's order because he promised them control of the trade revenue you built. What if I offer them something better? Not control of your revenue, ownership of their own. Full economic sovereignty. Release from every Valecourt obligation. The freedom to operate as independent houses for the first time in generations. You are buying their loyalty by giving away your power. I am making Draven's offer worthless by giving away what he promised to sell them. Aurelia stared at him for a long time. The granary was silent except for the sounds of the courtyard drifting through the high windows. Boots on stone, the creak of a cart, someone shouting about grain weights. The ordinary sounds of a place that did not know its existence was being bargained for. This is either the most brilliant political maneuver in the history of this dominion, she said quietly, or the most catastrophic act of self-destruction. Those might be the same thing. She almost smiled. Almost. The muscles around her mouth shifted, and then the expression settled into something more complex. Not amusement, but recognition. The recognition of a woman watching a man finally become the person she had suspected he might be, and understanding that the process of becoming was going to be violent and irreversible and might not end in survival. Give me 1 hour with the contracts, she said. I need to restructure the transfer language so the trade agreements survive the dissolution of Valecourt authority. If you're going to burn the empire, I am going to make sure the parts worth saving are fireproof. Done. And Cassian. He stopped at the doorway. When Draven walks through that gate, he will read the open courtyard and the unarmed garrison as weakness. He will interpret surrender as collapse. He will believe he has won before you say a single word. Yes. Good. Her eyes were steady. Let him believe it. The most dangerous moment in any negotiation is when one side stops paying attention because they think the outcome is decided. Is that Thornhaven wisdom? That is 300 years of surviving men who underestimated us. Cassian left the granary and walked across the courtyard and felt the sun on his face and the cold air in his lungs. And inside him, the new thing. The fragile, terrifying architecture that had started to form on the parapet the night before was hardening. Not into armor, into something else. Something that did not have a name yet because it had never existed inside a Valecourt before. A man who had spent his entire life building walls was about to tear them down in public, in front of the one person who had spent 15 years learning how to use those walls against him. And the only weapon Cassian would carry into that room was the one thing Draven had never seen him deploy, and therefore could not defend against. The truth. The column appeared on the eastern road at noon, 40 soldiers in formation, their armor catching the midday sun in disciplined flashes. Behind them, a covered carriage bearing the Chancellor's seal. Behind that, a second carriage carrying the legal delegation, 3 council arbiters, and a court scribe whose job was to document whatever happened at Ironmere in language that would become the official record. Brannock stood at the open gate, his garrison assembled behind him. 14 men, weapons sheathed, standing at formal attention. Not a defensive line, a receiving party. The column halted in the road. There was a pause, a visible recalculation, as the lead officer processed the open gate and the unarmed garrison. This was not what the briefing had described. The briefing had described a fortified position and a duke preparing for confrontation. Draven emerged from the carriage. He looked exactly as Cassian remembered, measured, composed. The particular stillness of a man who had learned to make silence a weapon decades before Cassian was born. His eyes swept the courtyard, the open gate, the standing garrison, the absence of any defensive preparation, and something moved behind his expression. Not concern, adjustment, the rapid, invisible reprocessing of a strategist encountering unexpected terrain. Cassian met him in the center of the courtyard. 2 men who had spent 15 years building a dominion together, facing each other across 10 feet of flagstone, and the distance between them contained more accumulated weight than the 60 miles of road that separated Blackthorn from Ironmere. Your Grace, Draven's voice was even, professional, carrying the same tone he had used in 10,000 morning briefings. I was not informed you would be present. You were informed. You intercepted my private correspondence to the Duchess. That is how you knew I would be absent from the capital. A flicker. Minimal. The diplomatic equivalent of a flinch. I acted on intelligence that suggested you acted on 15 years of patient dismantlement. Let us not waste time performing ignorance for each other. Cassian's voice carried across the courtyard. Every soldier in the column heard it. Every man in Brannock's garrison heard it. The workers gathered near the stables heard it. The court scribe, already extracting his instruments from the second carriage, heard it and began writing immediately. The great hall is prepared, Cassian said. Your delegation, your arbiters, your military commander. Init. Now. Draven studied him. The Chancellor's ability to read people was legendary. It was the skill that had made him indispensable and ultimately dangerous. He read Cassian the way he had always read Cassian, scanning for the familiar patterns, the predictable responses, the architecture of a man he had spent a decade and a half mapping. And for the first time, the map did not match the terrain. Something had changed. Draven could feel it the way an experienced sailor feels a shift in the current before the water visibly moves. The man standing in front of him looked like the Duke of Blackthorn, sounded like the Duke of Blackthorn, carried himself with the physical authority that the Valecourt bloodline had been breeding for 6 generations. But something in the eyes was different. Something Draven had never cataloged because it had never existed in the dataset. The Chancellor could not identify it, and that inability, that single gap in 15 years of comprehensive intelligence, produced a sensation in his stomach that he recognized as the first stage of operational uncertainty. He nodded once. Inside, then. The great hall of Ironmere Keep was stripped to essentials. 1 long oak table, 12 chairs, oil lamps along the walls casting a light that was functional, not ceremonial. This was not a throne room. It was a room for work, and its austerity communicated something that Draven registered without fully processing. This was a place where decisions had been made that mattered, and the absence of luxury was not poverty, but focus. They sat. Draven at one end, Cassian at the other, the 3 arbiters along one side, the military commander of the escort, a career officer named Voss, along the other. The scribe at a separate desk, his pen already moving. Aurelia entered last. She took the chair beside Cassian, not behind him, beside him. The positioning was deliberate, and Draven noted it with the clinical precision of a man who understood that spatial arrangements in rooms like this were a language as explicit as speech. The annulment order, Draven began, is endorsed by 11. I have read the document. Cassian's interruption was quiet but absolute. 11 countersignatures. Legal grounds citing unauthorized trade agreements, appropriation of crown resources, and sedition. You have built a thorough case. Then you understand the situation. Better than you imagine. Cassian reached into the leather case beside his chair and withdrew a bound portfolio. He placed it on the table. These are the hereditary contracts binding the 11 Eastern houses to Valecourt authority, debt obligations, trade restrictions, military conscription agreements, inheritance penalties, 6 generations of accumulated leverage. Draven's eyes moved to the portfolio. His expression did not change, but his breathing altered, a slight deepening, a fractional increase in rate. Cassian noticed because 12 hours ago, standing on a parapet above a valley of lights, he had learned to pay attention to breathing. I am not going to fight your annulment order, Draven. The room went still. Commander Voss shifted in his chair. The arbiters exchanged glances. The scribe's pen stopped moving for the first time since he sat down. I am going to void it, by destroying the legal framework it depends on. Cassian opened the portfolio. Inside were the original contracts, parchment documents bearing the seals of 6 generations of Valecourt rulers and 11 generations of Eastern nobles. The ink on the oldest was nearly illegible. The weight of them on the table was the weight of centuries. Every accusation in your order relies on the assumption that Valecourt authority over the Eastern provinces is legitimate, that the contracts binding those houses to our dominion represent a legal relationship between sovereign entities. They do not. They represent coercion, inherited debt imposed on families who had no choice in the original terms, military obligations extracted under threat of economic annihilation, trade restrictions designed to prevent independent prosperity. He looked at Draven. You know this. You administered this system for 15 years. You know exactly what these documents are. They are the legal foundation of the Dominion. They are chains, and I am breaking them. Now, in this room, in front of 3 council arbiters and a court scribe who will record every word for the official history. Cassian's hand rested on the portfolio. I am releasing every Eastern house from every hereditary obligation, dissolving every debt contract, removing every trade restriction, granting full economic and political sovereignty to every family that signed your annulment order. Draven's face changed. For the first time in the years Cassian had known him, the mask slipped. Not fully, not dramatically, but enough. The Chancellor's eyes widened by a millimeter. His hands, resting flat on the table in his characteristic posture of control, pressed harder against the wood. You cannot do this. I am the Duke of Blackthorn. These contracts bear my family's seal. I have the sole legal authority to void them. You will destroy the Dominion. I will destroy the cage. What grows in its place will be determined by the people who have been living inside it. Cassian's voice was granite. And your annulment order, your entire case against the Duchess, collapses the moment these contracts are void. You cannot accuse her of appropriating Crown resources when the Crown has voluntarily relinquished its claim to those resources. You cannot charge her with sedition against an authority structure that no longer exists. The silence in the Great Hall was absolute, the kind of silence that occurs when every person in a room simultaneously realizes that the ground they are standing on has fundamentally changed and no one has yet calculated the new geography. Draven recovered first. He was too experienced, too deeply constructed for anything less than rapid adaptation. The Eastern Lords will not accept this. You are giving them sovereignty they never asked for. Sovereignty requires infrastructure, military capability, economic independence. Most of these houses have been financing themselves through Aurelia's trade network for 9 months. They have infrastructure. They have revenue. They have economic relationships that function without Valecourt oversight. Cassian leaned forward. You built your coup on the assumption that I would try to keep the Empire intact, and you would simply replace me at its center. I am taking the Empire off the table entirely. This is madness. This is the first sane thing a Valecourt has done in 6 generations. Draven stood. The movement was controlled, but it carried a voltage that changed the air in the room. Commander Voss placed one hand on the table, a subtle gesture that signaled readiness without crossing into threat. You are bluffing, Draven said. You will not destroy your own legacy. My legacy is a system that produced you. Cassian stood to match him. They faced each other across the length of the table, and the distance between them was not 10 feet of oak, but 15 years of accumulated deception laid bare. A loyal chancellor who spent a decade and a half hollowing out the institution from the inside. That is the legacy of Valecourt control. It creates the conditions for its own destruction. I am simply completing the process. Draven's jaw tightened. Cassian could see the calculation happening in real time. The Chancellor's extraordinary mind-running scenarios, testing alternatives, searching for the lever that would restore the balance of power to the configuration he had spent years engineering. If you void those contracts, Draven said, you lose everything. Revenue, military authority, political control over a third of the kingdom. You become a duke of nothing. I become a duke who cannot be overthrown by a chancellor because there is nothing left to overthrow. And you think that protects you? I think it makes me the one person in this room who has nothing left to lose. And I have learned, recently, painfully, from a woman you tried to erase, that a person with nothing to lose is the most dangerous variable in any system. Cassian picked up the portfolio and held it over the single oil lamp burning at the center of the table. The parchment edges curled in the heat. Shadows leaped across the walls. Tell your 40 soldiers to stand down, Draven. Withdraw your annulment order. Walk out of Ironmere, and I will let you leave this room as a former chancellor instead of a convicted traitor. Or I burn 6 generations of Valecourt authority right now, and you spend the rest of your life explaining to 11 newly sovereign houses why you tried to seize an empire that no longer exists. The portfolio hung over the flame. The heat of it reached Cassian's knuckles. He felt the skin tighten, the nerve endings firing, the animal brain screaming to pull back, to preserve. to hold on to the only thing that connected him to every ancestor who had built and maintained and defended the power he was about to incinerate. Draven stared at him across the table. The Chancellor's face was a battlefield, calculation fighting disbelief, fighting the first raw edge of something that might have been fear. "You will not do it," Draven said. Cassian looked at Aurelia. She sat in her chair with her hands folded, her eyes steady, her breathing even. She did not nod. She did not signal. She simply looked back at him with the expression of a woman who had asked him what he was willing to lose and was now watching him discover the answer. The parchment caught. The first contract, the oldest, dating back to Cassian's great-great-grandfather, curled into flame with a sound like an exhaled breath. The fire climbed the edge, consumed the wax seal, turned the ink to smoke. Cassian held it until the heat reached his fingers, then dropped it onto the stone floor where it burned to ash in seconds. Draven's face went white. "Commander Voss?" Cassian's voice cut through the room like a blade laid flat on a table. "The Chancellor's legal authority derives from these contracts. In approximately 90 seconds, that authority will not exist. I suggest you consider carefully whose orders you intend to follow when the last page burns." Voss looked at Draven, looked at Cassian, looked at the burning portfolio that the Duke was now feeding to the lamp one document at a time, each page flaring and dying, each flame consuming another century of accumulated control. The commander made his choice in the space between one heartbeat and the next. He straightened in his chair, removed his hand from the table, and said two words that restructured the political landscape of the eastern provinces. "Stand down!" Draven heard it, his head turned toward Voss with the sharp, involuntary motion of a man who has just felt the last support beam give way beneath him. The Chancellor's mouth opened. No sound came out. For the first time in 15 years of flawless performance, Draven Hale had no script and no contingency and no architecture to retreat to. Cassian burned the last contract. The flame ate through the final seal, his own family's crest, pressed into wax by his father's hand 20 years ago. And then there was nothing. Ash on the stone floor, smoke in the air, the smell of consumed parchment hanging in the great hall like the aftermath of a detonation. 6 generations of Valecourt dominion, reduced to carbon in under 2 minutes. Cassian looked at his hands. The fingers of his right hand were red from the heat, the skin tight and stinging. He flexed them once. The pain was clarifying, real. The kind of sensation that belonged to a man who had just done something that could not be reversed, standing in the wreckage of his own inheritance, and discovering that the absence of everything he had been trained to protect felt not like loss, but like the first full breath after years of constriction. He looked up at Draven. The Chancellor stood at the far end of the table, and the expression on his face was something Cassian had never seen there before. Not defeat. Draven was too composed for anything that simple. It was the look of a man staring at a board where every piece has been swept away, and realizing that the opponent he had studied for 15 years had just played a move that existed outside the boundaries of the game. "It is over, Draven." The Chancellor's hands were fists at his sides. His breathing was audible now, short, controlled pulls of air that betrayed the magnitude of the internal collapse happening behind his eyes. "Nothing is over." Draven's voice was low, stripped of its professional veneer, the raw sound of a man whose 15-year operation had just been incinerated, along with the documents that gave it legal meaning. "You think burning paper changes the reality of power. You think sovereignty is a gift you can hand to houses that have never governed themselves. These families will tear each other apart within a year. The trade routes will collapse. The military structure will fragment. And when the chaos reaches Blackthorn, then Blackthorn will face it without the crutch of inherited coercion." Cassian's voice did not rise. It did not need to. "And so will I." Draven stared at him for 3 seconds. 4, 5. The longest silence between them in 15 years of partnership. And in that silence, something passed between them that was not negotiation, not strategy, not the calibrated exchange of power that had defined their relationship since the day Draven first entered Cassian's service. It was recognition. The recognition that the man standing at the other end of the table was no longer the man Draven had spent 15 years managing. The Chancellor turned and walked toward the door. He stopped at the threshold, did not turn around. "She did this to you," he said. His voice was quiet, almost private, as though the room had emptied and only the two of them remained. "The woman you exiled to a ruin, she dismantled you more thoroughly than I ever could." Cassian said nothing. Draven left. The sound of his boots on the stone corridor faded. Then the distant clatter of the carriage. Then the creak of the courtyard gate as 40 soldiers began their withdrawal, following a commander who had changed his allegiance in a single heartbeat, and a chancellor who had nothing left to command. The great hall was quiet, ash on the floor, smoke in the rafters, 3 arbiters sitting in stunned silence, a scribe whose pages were filled with the record of an empire's voluntary dissolution. Cassian sat down heavily in his chair. The adrenaline was draining now, leaving behind a tremor in his hands that he could not suppress and did not try to. He looked at the ash. He looked at his burned fingers. He looked at the empty table where 6 generations of power had rested for less than a minute before he fed them to the fire. Then he looked at Aurelia. She had not moved, had not spoken, had not reached for him or offered comfort or performed any of the gestures that the moment seemed to demand. She simply sat in her chair and looked back at him with eyes that held something he was only beginning to learn how to read. Not admiration, not relief, not the vindicated satisfaction of a woman whose strategy had prevailed. What he saw in her face was the thing she had described on their first night together. The thing she had identified in his white knuckles and his 1 glass of whiskey and his rehearsed speech about a dead woman. She was watching a man who had just survived himself, and she was waiting to see what he would build next. Outside the Great Hall, through walls that had been rebuilt by hands his dynasty had neglected for a decade, the sounds of Ironmere continued. Hammers on stone, carts on roads. The persistent, ordinary industry of a place that had chosen to exist. But somewhere on the road back to Blackthorn, a carriage carried a former chancellor who had just been stripped of everything he had spent 15 years constructing, and the expression on Dravenhale's face as the miles accumulated between him and Ironmere was not the expression of a man who had accepted defeat. It was the expression of a man recalculating. Dravenhale made it 47 miles before the Eastern Lords intercepted him. The news reached Ironmere 3 days after the confrontation in the Great Hall. A dispatch rider from Lord Aldrich Cavendish, the most senior of the 11 Eastern nobles, delivered the message directly to Brannock, who brought it to Cassian in the study where the Duke had been working since dawn. Not ruling, not commanding, but working, bent over agricultural projections with ink-stained fingers, and the particular exhaustion of a man rebuilding the foundations of a structure while still standing inside it. The dispatch was brief. The Eastern Lords had convened an emergency council upon receiving word of the contract dissolution. When Draven's carriage passed through Cavendish territory, Lord Aldrich had ordered it stopped. The Chancellor was not harmed. He was detained. The 11 houses that had signed Draven's annulment order now requested an audience with the Duke to discuss the new political arrangement. Cassian read the dispatch and set it down. "They want to know if it is real," he said. Brannock stood at the door. "Is it? The contracts are ash on the floor of your great hall. It does not get more real than that. With respect, Your Grace, I have seen powerful men burn documents and then produce copies from locked vaults. The Eastern Lords have survived 6 generations of Valecourt rule by assuming that every gesture of generosity conceals a mechanism of control." Cassian looked up. The commander's face was careful, measured, the expression of a man who had learned to trust Aurelia completely and was still calibrating how far that trust extended to the husband. "There are no copies," Cassian said. "Then you should tell them yourself." The council convened at Ironmere 12 days later. Not at Blackthorn. That was deliberate, and Aurelia's suggestion. The capital represented the old architecture, the old power. If Cassian wanted the Eastern Lords to believe that the world had genuinely changed, he needed to meet them on ground that belonged to the new one. 11 lords and ladies filed into the great hall where the ash stains still marked the stone floor. Cassian had ordered them left, not as theater, as evidence. The lords needed to see what was gone before they could believe in what might come next. Aurelia stood beside him, not behind. The positioning had become permanent. a spatial declaration that neither of them discussed because discussion would have diminished what the arrangement communicated on its own. Lord Aldrich Cavendish spoke first. He was 63, white-haired, built like a man who had survived decades of political maneuvering through a combination of intelligence and stubbornness that his allies called resilience and his enemies called something less charitable. His family had been bound to the Valecourt dynasty for 4 generations. His grandfather had signed the original debt contract under duress during a famine that the Valecourts had engineered by redirecting grain shipments. "We have read the dissolution terms," Aldrich said. "Full sovereignty, release from all hereditary obligation, economic independence." "Those are the terms," Cassian said. "And what do you retain?" "Blackthorn proper, the capital and its immediate territory, the 3 western ports, enough to sustain a duchy without requiring tribute from the eastern provinces. That is a third of what you held. That is what I built versus what my ancestors stole." The word stole moved through the room like a current. Several of the lords shifted in their chairs. Lady Maren Ashwick, the youngest of the 11, 31, sharp-featured, and possessed of a directness that the older nobles found either refreshing or alarming depending on the day, leaned forward. "You will forgive our skepticism, Your Grace. The Valecourt family has spent 6 generations perfecting the art of disguising control's generosity. Your father offered our houses reduced tariffs during the Northern Crisis. The reduction lasted 2 years. The intelligence networks he embedded in our households during that period lasted considerably longer. I am aware of my father's methods. Are you aware that we have spent the last week debating whether this dissolution is a genuine restructuring or an elaborate trap designed to identify which houses accept sovereignty and then punish them for the ambition?" Cassian let the question sit. He could feel the weight of it, not just the political calculation, but the human reality underneath. These were people whose families had lived for generations inside a system designed to make independence feel like treason. The psychological architecture of subjugation did not dissolve with contracts. It lived in the nervous system, in the instinct that said every open door conceals a cage. "I cannot prove a negative," he said. "I cannot demonstrate the absence of a trap. I can only tell you what I know to be true, which is that the system I inherited required a man like Dravenhale to operate, and a man like Dravenhale will always eventually operate it for himself. The contracts I burned were not just instruments of control over your houses. They were the mechanism through which my own chancellor dismantled my authority from the inside. The system that enslaved you also destroyed me. I am not releasing you out of virtue. I am releasing you because the alternative is building the same cage again and waiting for the next Draven to walk through the door I leave open." The room was quiet for a long time. Aldrich Cavendish studied Cassian with the particular intensity of a man who had spent 63 years learning to distinguish between sincerity and performance. He looked at the ash stains on the floor. He looked at Aurelia. He looked at the bare walls of a great hall that contained no banners, no crests, no symbols of inherited authority. "And the Chancellor," Aldrich said, "what do you propose?" "Trial. Open proceedings. Every house represented. Every accusation documented, every piece of evidence examined in public, not behind closed doors where the outcome can be negotiated in advance. He will implicate you. He will implicate the system I maintained, the system I have now dissolved. Whatever damage his testimony does to the Valecourt name is damage I have already chosen to accept." Lady Maren spoke again. "You are offering us sovereignty and simultaneously exposing your family's legacy to public destruction. What prevents us from using the trial to further diminish Valecourt authority and seize what remains of your territory?" "Nothing." Cassian's voice was level. "Nothing prevents it. That is the point. The old system functioned because I held leverage over every house in this room. I have voluntarily destroyed that leverage. What happens next depends entirely on whether a group of sovereign houses can build something functional together, or whether freedom without a common enemy simply produces a different kind of destruction." He looked around the table. 11 faces, some hostile, some calculating, some carrying the first tentative edge of something that might, with time and evidence, become trust. "I am betting on the first outcome," he said, "but I acknowledge that I might be wrong. And the willingness to be wrong, to act without the guarantee of control, is the only thing I can offer you that my family has never offered before." The council lasted 4 days. The negotiations were brutal, granular, and conducted with the particular ferocity of people who had spent their lives navigating a political landscape where every concession was a trap and every alliance was temporary. Aurelia managed most of it, not because Cassian could not, he had the political intelligence to hold his own in any room, but because the Eastern lords trusted her in a way they did not yet trust him. She had spent 9 months building trade relationships with these houses. She had visited their villages. She had eaten at their tables. She had earned what Cassian was still learning to ask for. He watched her work. It was a revelation, not the political skill. He had known she was brilliant since their wedding night, when she had dissected his psychology with the precision of a surgeon and the calm of someone who had been expecting exactly what she found. What revealed itself during those 4 days was something different. She operated without armor, without the protective mechanisms that Cassian had spent his life constructing and maintaining and defending against the people closest to him. She disagreed openly. She admitted uncertainty. She changed her position when presented with evidence. She treated the Eastern lords as equals, not because it was strategically advantageous, but because she could not function any other way. And the lords responded. Not with the performed deference that the Valecourt name had always extracted. With engagement, genuine, combative, productive engagement, the kind that only occurred between people who believed the outcome of the conversation could actually be influenced by what they said. Cassian observed this from his chair at the head of the table, and somewhere in the process of watching his wife build a political framework that did not require coercion to function, the last piece of something fell into place inside him, not dramatically, not with the narrative satisfaction of a climactic revelation. Quietly, the way the most important things in a life tend to arrive, not as thunderbolts, but as the gradual, irreversible recognition that the ground has been shifting for months, and you are only now looking down. He had spent 31 years believing that strength meant the ability to hold everything in place, to control outcomes, to prevent the world from changing in ways he had not authorized. And that belief had produced exactly what it deserved, a dominion held together by force and a soul held together by grief, both of which had been quietly rotting from the inside while he maintained the exterior with obsessive, desperate precision. Aurelia's strength was the opposite. It was the willingness to let things move, to release control and trust that what grew in its absence would be more durable than what submission produced. She had demonstrated this at Ironmere, building an economy that functioned without coercion, a community that held together without inherited obligation, a life that required no one's permission to exist, and she had demonstrated it with him, on their wedding night when she absorbed his cruelty and returned clarity. During 9 months of exile, when she built an empire from his punishment without once asking for acknowledgement, on the parapet when he said, "I love you," and she did not reciprocate because reciprocation on demand was just another form of compliance, and she would not give him that no matter how much they both wanted it. She would give it when it was real, when it was free, when it arose from genuine choice rather than the pressure of a moment designed to produce a specific response. That was the thing Cassian was learning, the thing that hurt more than burning the contracts, more than watching his legacy turn to ash, more than standing in a room full of people who had every reason to destroy him and choosing to let them decide. The real cost of becoming someone new was not the loss of power. It was the loss of certainty. The willingness to stand in the space between who you were and who you might become, without knowing whether the crossing would kill you or save you, and to keep standing there anyway, because the alternative was going back to a version of yourself that had already proven itself bankrupt. The council ended on the 4th day with a provisional framework, a trade alliance between the 11 Eastern houses, Ironmere and Blackthorn, structured as a partnership of equals with shared governance and rotating leadership. It was imperfect. It was fragile. It contained enough competing interests and unresolved tensions to collapse 6 different ways if the wrong pressure was applied at the wrong moment. It was also the first political agreement in the history of the region that every party had entered voluntarily. And that fact, more than any structural innovation, was what gave it a chance of surviving. The lords departed. Ironmere emptied. The great hall returned to its usual function, A working room where Brannock held garrison briefings and Aurelia met with trade delegations, and the business of running a restored province continued with the steady, unglamorous persistence that had defined the place since the Duchess arrived, with a carriage full of census documents and a question about roof integrity. Cassian stayed, not because he was required, not because Ironmere needed a duke, because Blackthorn, the castle, the capital, the entire apparatus of centralized authority that his family had built and maintained for 6 generations, no longer felt like a place he could inhabit without becoming the man he had just spent 4 days trying to stop being. The architecture of the castle was the architecture of the old identity. Every corridor, every chamber, every throne room and war room and treasury vault was designed to produce the specific psychology of dominance. To walk those halls was to feel the pull of the old patterns, the reflexive reach for control, the instinct to manage and direct and suppress anything that operated outside the boundaries he had drawn. At Ironmere, the architecture was different, not because the fortress was more beautiful or more comfortable. It was neither. But the spaces here had been rebuilt for function, not performance. The walls existed to shelter, not to project. The rooms were designed for work, not for the theatrical display of power. And the woman who had rebuilt them moved through them with the ease of someone who had created an environment that matched what she actually was, rather than what she needed others to believe. Cassian began the slow, unglamorous work of inhabiting that architecture. He met with village leaders. He reviewed trade logistics. He spent a full week in the field with Brannock's scouts, mapping the road network and identifying infrastructure gaps that would need to be addressed before the winter trade season. He got mud on his boots. He ate meals in the garrison mess hall instead of alone in a private chamber. He learned the names of the stonemasons and the merchants and the farmers who operated the market stalls, and the process of learning those names, of recognizing individual people as individual people rather than as data points in an administrative system, was as difficult and disorienting as anything he had experienced, because it required the activation of capacities he had spent 7 years starving to death. Aurelia watched this transformation without comment. She did not guide it, did not praise it, did not offer the reassurance that would have allowed Cassian to convert the process into performance, to become a man who was seen to be changing rather than a man who was actually changing. She simply continued doing what she had always done, working, building, existing with a solidity that did not depend on his approval or participation or even his presence. And that solidity, the refusal to adjust herself to accommodate his journey, was the hardest thing to bear and the most necessary. Because every previous relationship in Cassian's life had been structured around his gravitational pull. People orbited him, adapted to him, shaped themselves to his requirements, and called it loyalty or love or service. Aurelia did not orbit. She stood where she stood, and if he wanted to be near her, he had to walk to where she was. He walked. It took months. The trial of Draven Hale was conducted in Ashwick, on neutral ground, with representatives from all 11 eastern houses and a panel of arbiters drawn from beyond the Dominion to ensure impartiality. Cassian attended. He sat in the public gallery, not on a dais, not in a position of authority, because the proceedings were not his to control, and he had learned, was still learning, would probably spend the rest of his life learning, that the compulsion to control was the scar, not the cure. Draven was composed throughout. He presented his defense with the same measured intelligence that had made him indispensable for 15 years, and his central argument was as sharp as Cassian had expected. The system was corrupt. The system had always been corrupt. He had not betrayed the Duke. He had simply recognized that the Duke's authority was built on exploitation and had attempted to redirect that exploitation toward more productive ends. The fact that those ends served Draven personally was, he argued, no different from the fact that the original contract served the Valecourts personally. Power was power. The only question was who wielded it. Cassian listened to this argument and recognized its logic, which was the logic of the man he used to be. The argument assumed that power was a fixed quantity that moved between hands but never changed its nature, that the only choices available were to hold it, lose it, or take it from someone else. That the idea of voluntarily dissolving power, of choosing to build something that did not require domination to function, was either naive or a more sophisticated form of control. He understood why Draven believed this. He had believed it himself for 31 years. The belief was not stupid. It was the product of an environment that confirmed it at every turn. An environment in which vulnerability was punished, trust was exploited, and the only reliable strategy for survival was the accumulation of leverage over everyone within reach. What Draven could not see, what Cassian himself could not have seen 12 months ago, was that the environment was not reality. It was a construct, a self-fulfilling system that produced the behavior it was designed to predict, and then pointed to that behavior as evidence of its own necessity. People betrayed because the system rewarded betrayal. People hoarded power because the system punished those who shared it. And the men who ran the system, men like Draven, men like the old Cassian, looked at the wreckage they had produced and concluded that human nature was the problem, when in fact human nature was simply responding to the architecture it inhabited. Change the architecture and you change the response. Not immediately, not completely, not without setbacks and betrayals and the persistent grinding difficulty of building trust in an environment where trust had been a liability for generations. But the possibility existed. Aurelia had proven it at Ironmere. 11 villages had proven it by choosing to stay. The Eastern Lords were proving it now, imperfectly and contentiously, by attempting to govern themselves without a dynasty holding the reins. The tribunal convicted Draven of corruption and conspiracy against ducal authority. The sentence was exile, permanent removal from the dominion with forfeiture of all assets accumulated during his chancellorship. Not execution, not imprisonment, exile. Because the new system Cassian was trying to build could not begin with the same kind of decisive brutality that had characterized the old one, even when the target deserved it. Draven accepted the verdict without visible emotion. As he was escorted from the tribunal hall, he passed within arm's reach of Cassian. The two men looked at each other. 15 years of shared history compressed into a single exchange of glances. "You will fail," Draven said quietly. Not with malice, with the clinical certainty of a diagnosis. Humans do not sustain systems built on trust. They sustain systems built on incentive. Remove the incentive structure and you remove the architecture. What remains is sentiment, and sentiment does not survive contact with self-interest. Cassian held his gaze. "Maybe, but I would rather fail at something worth building than succeed at something that eats its own foundation." Draven studied him one last time. Something moved behind his eyes. Not agreement, not conversion, but the faint, reluctant acknowledgement of a man recognizing that the opponent he had spent 15 years managing had become someone he could no longer predict. Then the former chancellor walked through the doors and into the permanent silence of a life stripped of the only thing he had ever valued. And Cassian watched him go, and felt the particular grief of losing an enemy who had also been, for 15 years, the closest thing he had to a partner. Spring came to the eastern provinces with the specific, unsubtle aggression that weather systems in that region preferred. 3 weeks of continuous rain followed by a sudden, almost violent burst of warmth that turned the valley floor green within days. The river routes that Aurelia had reopened swelled with snowmelt and carried the first major trade shipments of the season, and the villages along the corridor responded with the accumulated energy of communities that had survived a winter of uncertainty and emerged on the other side with their structures intact. Ironmere Keep stood complete. The last tower, the one whose collapse Brannick had mentioned to Aurelia on her first day, a casual fact about a ruin that had become the starting point of something neither of them could have predicted, had been rebuilt during the winter. New stone fitted to old. The mortar was a different color, lighter, and in the afternoon sun the tower looked like what it was, a structure that carried its history visibly, the original construction and the restoration existing side by side, neither pretending to be the other. Cassian stood on the northern parapet on a spring evening and looked at the valley below. The same parapet, the same view. But the man standing there was not the man who had stood there 9 months ago and said, "I love you," with the desperate, graceless urgency of someone discovering a capacity he thought he had killed. That man had been on the edge of something. This man was inside it. Aurelia joined him. She had been in the study reviewing the quarterly trade reports that now arrived from 11 independent houses, instead of being generated by a single chancellor's office. The reports were messier than Draven's had been, less uniform, more argumentative. Several contained direct contradictions that reflected genuine disagreements between houses about taxation policy and resource allocation. It was chaotic. It was functional. It was what self-governance actually looked like when it was not curated by a single intelligence with its own agenda. She stood beside him at the battlement and looked at the valley and did not speak for a long time. The silence between them had changed over the months. It used to carry weight, the pressure of unspoken assessments, undelivered verdicts, the strategic calculations of two people who had learned to treat intimacy as a negotiation. Now it carried something else. The particular comfort of two people who had stopped performing for each other and discovered that what remained, unperformed, was enough. Aldrich Cavendish sent a message today, she said. Good news or bad? Both. The Trade Council approved the Joint Infrastructure Fund for the Northern Road, but Lady Marin is objecting to the cost allocation formula and threatening to withdraw her house's contribution unless the western stretch is prioritized. Marin objects to everything. Marin objects to things she believes are wrong. That is not the same as objecting to everything, even though it feels that way when you are on the receiving end. Aurelia glanced at him. You should meet with her directly. She responds to honesty better than diplomacy. Most people do. It just took me an unusually long time to figure that out. The corner of her mouth moved. Not quite a smile. The thing she did instead of smiling, a subtle shift in the geometry of her expression that communicated something warmer and more precise than a smile could manage. Do you regret it? She said. He knew what she was asking. Not Draven, not the trial, not any specific decision in the chain of events that had led from a wedding night to a ruin, to a burning portfolio to this parapet on a spring evening. She was asking about the totality, the entire arc, the man he had been and the man he had become, and the distance between those two versions of himself, which was not measured in miles or months, but in the systematic dismantlement of everything he had believed about power and control and the human capacity for change. Cassian looked at the valley. The light was doing the thing it did at this hour, turning the river to copper, catching the windows of the rebuilt villages, making the landscape look like something a painter would create, if the painter understood that beauty was not the absence of damage, but the persistence of life within it. I regret the years, he said. The years I spent maintaining a grief I had outgrown because the grief was easier than whatever came next. The years I spent treating people as instruments. The years I lost with you because I was too committed to a dead woman's memory to recognize a living woman's worth. He turned to face her. In the evening light, her features held the same sharp clarity he had noted at their wedding. The angles, the watchful eyes, the particular configuration of a face that did not perform emotion but simply contained it, precisely and without waste. I do not regret the burning, he said. I do not regret the dissolution. And I do not regret standing on this parapet 9 months ago and saying something I was not ready to say, because I have spent every day since then trying to become someone who deserves the fact that you did not say it back. Aurelia held his eyes. The wind off the valley moved through her hair, and the light shifted, and for a moment she looked exactly like what she was. A woman who had rebuilt a ruin and a region, and a man, in that order, using nothing but the stubborn, unflinching clarity that 300 years of Thornhaven survival had bred into her. You deserved it then, she said. You were just too damaged to believe it. And now you are still damaged. You are just building with it instead of hiding behind it. She reached out and took his hand. Her fingers found the scarred skin on his right hand, the burn marks from the night he fed 6 generations of contracts to a lamp flame. The scar tissue was smooth, permanent, a physical record of the moment he had chosen destruction over control. She traced the scars with her thumb. The touch was not gentle in the way that comfort is gentle. It was deliberate, specific. The touch of a woman who was acknowledging damage without pitying it. I love you, she said. 3 words. Delivered without performance, without the dramatic architecture that moments like this demanded in stories. She said it the way she said everything, clearly, directly, with the full weight of a mind that did not waste language on anything it did not mean. Cassian felt the words land in the place where, a year ago, there had been nothing but compressed grief and the cold machinery of control. The place that had been emptied and burned and rebuilt, imperfectly, painfully, with the same combination of old stone and new mortar that characterized the tower rising behind them. He did not say it back, not because he did not feel it, because she already knew. She had known since the parapet 9 months ago. She had known since their wedding night, when she looked at his white knuckles and understood what he was before he understood it himself. Saying it again would have been redundant, and they had both moved past the need for redundancy. Instead, he tightened his hand around hers, and they stood together on the parapet and watched the valley darken as the sun dropped behind the western ridge. The villages lit their lamps one by one, a slow, scattered illumination that was nothing like the coordinated display of power that Blackthorn Castle produced every evening, all its windows blazing simultaneously to remind the world of its dominance. This was different, each light independent, each household choosing its own moment to push back the dark. The cumulative effect was not uniformity, but constellation, a pattern that emerged from individual choices rather than central command. Below them, Ironmere's courtyard settled into its evening routines. The gate was open. It was always open now. Not because there were no threats. The world beyond the valley was as complicated and dangerous as it had ever been, but because the fortress had learned something that Blackthorn Castle never had, that a place defined by its openness was harder to destroy than a place defined by its walls. Walls could be breached. Openness could only be occupied, and occupation required the consent of the occupied, and consent, once withdrawn, left the occupier holding nothing but empty architecture. Cassian thought about his father, about the old duke who had collapsed in the middle of a council session, his heart giving out under the accumulated weight of a lifetime spent maintaining control over everything within reach. He thought about 6 generations of Valecourt rulers, who had each inherited the same system and the same psychology and the same unquestioned belief that the purpose of power was the preservation of power. He thought about Evelyn, whose memory he had maintained like a shrine because the shrine gave him permission to remain closed. And he let that thought pass through him without resistance, without grief, without the familiar clench of a man holding a wound open because the wound had become his identity. She was gone. She had been gone for a long time. And the man who had used her death to justify a decade of emotional vacancy was also gone. Not dead, not erased, but dissolved into the person standing on this parapet, holding his wife's hand, feeling the evening air cool against his skin, watching a valley full of independent lights, and knowing that he had played a part in their existence without owning them. The Duke of Blackthorn, who had measured love as possession and power as ownership, had surrendered both. And in the wreckage of everything he had been, standing on the restored walls of a fortress his wife had rebuilt from the ruin he condemned her to, he found that the absence of control did not feel like loss. It felt like the first full breath after years of holding. The lights multiplied below. The valley breathed. The wind carried the distant sound of a market bell from Thornfield, the village where, months ago, Aurelia had watched a woman buy bread and recognized in that small transaction the fundamental decision to believe in tomorrow. Cassian listened to that bell and understood finally what it meant. Not commerce, not recovery, not the measurable, quantifiable metrics that his old self would have used to evaluate the success of a regional development initiative. It meant that people had chosen to stay, that in a valley abandoned by his dynasty and restored by his wife, ordinary people had looked at what was being built and decided it was worth inhabiting, worth defending. Worth the daily, unglamorous commitment of waking up and going to work and lighting a lamp at dusk and believing that the light would be there again tomorrow. That was the thing no contract could compel and no army could enforce, and no duke, however powerful, could command into existence. It could only be earned, slowly, imperfectly. Through the accumulated evidence of actions that matched words, that matched intentions, that matched the stubborn, frightening, irreversible decision to be honest about who you were and what you had done and what you were willing to become. Aurelia leaned against him. The weight of her, slight, solid, real, settled against his shoulder, and Cassian closed his eyes, and for the first time in as long as he could remember, the darkness behind his eyelids contained nothing he needed to suppress. No grief maintained as strategy, no memory weaponized into armor, no carefully constructed architecture of control holding him upright through force rather than foundation. Just a man. standing on a wall, holding the hand of a woman who had refused to stay where she was put. Below them, Blackthorn's legacy scattered to the wind. The old one, the one built on chains and ledgers, and the inherited machinery of domination. What remained was smaller, messier, unfinished in the way that living things are always unfinished, always growing, always in the process of becoming something that has not yet declared its final shape. The bell rang again across the valley. Cassian opened his eyes. The lights were still there.